will no longer be possible for me to give so much of my time and energies to the charities and issues for which I care so deeply.
King Charles makes history with last public act. Camilla ordered to leave Windsor Lodge. Okay, stay with me, because that title points to something far more serious than a routine change of royal residence. According to the dramatic account surrounding this story, Charles's final public appearance was followed by a decision that allegedly changed Camilla's position at Windsor Lodge almost overnight. The issue was not simply where Camilla would live, it was whether she still had the right to remain there at all. And that is what makes this case different. The claim is that senior advisors had been examining the arrangements surrounding Windsor Lodge when an overlooked condition reportedly surfaced in the residence records. Suddenly, questions that had been quietly circulating inside the household were no longer about furniture, renovations, or private preferences. They were about authority, access, royal resources, and the conditions under which Camilla had been allowed to occupy the property. Then came the moment that changed the entire direction of the story. Charles appeared publicly, with cameras focused on him and attention fixed on what could have been an ordinary royal engagement. But behind that public appearance, according to the account, the palace was already dealing with a decision that could force Camilla out of Windsor Lodge. And while the public watched the king, the question inside the palace was becoming painfully simple. Would Charles allow the arrangement to continue, or would he finally draw the line? Hi viewers, if you were in Charles's position and discovered something this serious had been overlooked, would you stay silent or demand answers? Be honest and put your answer in the comments. Because this is where the story takes an uncomfortable turn. The account suggests that Camilla's advisors had expected the matter to remain private until the king's position was settled. There was reportedly no expectation that the residence issue would suddenly become connected to Charles's final public act. That timing matters. It meant the decision was not simply another administrative adjustment buried inside palace paperwork. It appeared to carry a message about who could exercise authority inside a royal residence, and how far that authority could actually go. The first signs of trouble were allegedly buried in records that most people would never see. Household arrangements, property information, renovation requests, access instructions, and previous commitments were reportedly being examined together. Separately, none of those documents necessarily looked explosive. Put them side by side, however, and a different picture began to emerge. That is precisely why the alleged discovery became so important. The issue was no longer whether Camilla had been comfortable at Windsor Lodge. The issue was whether comfort had somehow been mistaken for permanence. A residence can look secure from the outside, while the paperwork underneath tells an entirely different story. And according to the account, that distinction was exactly what Charles's advisors were beginning to uncover.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. Throughout her life, Her Majesty the Queen.
For Camilla, the timing could hardly have been worse. The residence had reportedly become associated with a level of control that made the possibility of leaving seem almost unthinkable. Yet the documents were allegedly forcing palace officials to ask a question that had apparently been avoided for far too long. What exactly had Charles authorized? What had never been authorized? And what conditions had been attached to Camilla's occupancy from the beginning? That question also explains why the king's public appearance suddenly carries so much weight in this account. It was not simply the appearance itself. It was what allegedly happened around it. Charles was approaching a moment when every gesture, every statement, and every decision could be interpreted as a signal about the future of the monarchy. If he really was preparing to make a major change, doing it at that particular moment would make the decision impossible to dismiss as a minor household adjustment. And yet, there was still one thing missing: proof. A recommendation was not enough. An advisor raising a concern was not enough. A disagreement between royal households was not enough. Before Charles could make a decision of this magnitude, the palace would need something far more concrete. It would need to establish what Windsor Lodge actually was, what Camilla had actually been granted, and whether the conditions attached to that arrangement had been respected. That is where the records become the most important part of the story.
My beloved mother was an inspiration, an example to me and to all my family. And we owe her the most heartfelt debt any family can owe to their mother.
According to the account, officials began looking beyond the obvious paperwork and into the details surrounding the property's use. They reportedly examined previous commitments, household instructions, spending arrangements, and the way access to the residence had been handled. Each record raised another question. Each answer created another gap, and somewhere inside that growing file was allegedly a clause that had escaped attention until now. A clause that could change everything. Because if that condition really existed, then Camilla's position at Windsor Lodge may never have been as permanent as she believed. The apparent security of the residence could have depended on rules that were still enforceable, and if those rules had been breached, the king would not simply be deciding whether Camilla should move. He would be deciding whether the arrangement itself had already reached its limit. That possibility was reportedly enough to change the mood inside the palace. What had begun as a review was becoming something much more serious. Advisors were no longer asking what Camilla wanted. They were asking what the records allowed. They were no longer considering whether a disagreement could be quietly managed. They were examining whether a formal decision had become unavoidable. And then came the detail that made Charles's final public appearance look very different. The decision was allegedly moving closer, while Camilla still had no reason to believe that Windsor Lodge was about to become the center of a royal confrontation. The public saw the king. Behind the scenes, however, the palace was reportedly assembling the evidence that could determine her future there. If you think Charles should have drawn the line sooner, do not just watch what happens next. Stay with this story, because the records were about to reveal why the Windsor Lodge decision became much worse than anyone expected. The first warning did not arrive with a confrontation. It arrived as a change in the way people inside Windsor Lodge were being told to behave. Staff members who had once moved freely through the residence were reportedly given new instructions about who could enter, which rooms could be used, and which arrangements now required approval. None of those instructions, taken alone, explained why the king's advisors were suddenly interested. Together, however, they pointed toward a question that could no longer be ignored. Who had actually been running the residence? According to the account, Camilla's household had begun making decisions that went beyond ordinary personal preferences. Rooms were being reconsidered, staff responsibilities were changing, family access was becoming more controlled, renovation plans were being discussed, with an assumption that the residence would remain available to Camilla for the long term. That assumption mattered. A person can redecorate a room because they prefer a different style. A household can change staff because responsibilities have changed. But when several decisions begin moving in the same direction, palace administrators have to ask whether they are looking at isolated choices or a broader transfer of control. That was reportedly the concern building around Windsor Lodge. The most sensitive issue involved the property's identity. Windsor Lodge was not being treated simply as a private place to sleep. Its rooms, furnishings, staff arrangements and access had connections to the wider royal household. According to the account, some decisions were beginning to make those shared connections harder to recognize. Then attention turned to the people carrying out the changes. Long-serving employees allegedly found themselves facing new instructions without clear explanations. Some were reportedly reassigned. Others were told that particular rooms or duties were no longer under their previous arrangements. The important detail was not merely that staff changes were happening, it was that the changes appeared to follow the same pattern as the new control over the residence. The more officials examined the situation, the harder it became to separate household management from personal authority. That is where the story became dangerous for Camilla. If every decision could be explained as routine, the matter would probably have ended there. But according to the account, administrators began asking for written confirmation. They wanted to know who had approved particular changes, who had authorized spending, and whether the arrangements matched the terms governing the residence. Those requests created a problem.
This is also a time of change for my family. I count on the loving help of my darling wife, Camilla.
A verbal understanding can sound powerful inside a royal household. On paper, it has limits. The account claims that some requests for clarification did not produce the kind of documentation officials expected. Instead of finding a clear permanent grant, they reportedly encountered arrangements that required closer examination. And that changed the question again. It was no longer, does Camilla use Windsor Lodge? It became, under what conditions does she use it? That distinction is crucial because the title of this story is not simply about Camilla leaving a royal property. It is about the alleged moment when the king decided that the conditions surrounding her occupancy could no longer be treated casually. By this stage, palace officials were reportedly looking at more than one category of information. Property arrangements were being compared with household instructions. Renovation plans were being considered alongside staffing changes. Access decisions were being examined against the property's wider purpose. A pattern was forming. But the most revealing evidence had not yet surfaced. According to the account, attention eventually moved toward belongings associated with earlier members of the royal family. That development raised the temperature because moving ordinary furniture is one thing, moving items with family significance is another. The records allegedly showed that certain belongings had been removed from their usual locations and placed elsewhere. The explanation surrounding those movements became important because officials reportedly wanted to know whether the transfers had been properly authorized. That was the point when the dispute stopped looking like a disagreement over taste. It began looking like a dispute over who had the right to decide. And there was another problem waiting in the paperwork. The residence arrangements reportedly contained language that could limit what happened when royal resources were used improperly or when access and property conditions were not respected. The exact significance of that language depended on the full record, which is why advisors were reportedly unwilling to make a final recommendation until every related document had been checked. For Camilla, that meant the situation was becoming less personal and more procedural. That is a dangerous shift inside any institution built around rules. Personal influence can shape a conversation. Documentation can end it. The people reviewing Windsor Lodge were therefore not simply asking what had happened. They were reconstructing how each decision had been made, who had received instructions, and whether earlier concerns had been raised before the changes continued. That review also exposed why the staff issue mattered more than it first appeared. Household employees do not simply know which rooms are open. They know which instructions are normal, which approvals are required, and which decisions would usually pass through administrators before anyone acts. According to the account, some employees became increasingly cautious because instructions were arriving through private channels rather than the familiar administrative process. That reportedly created uncertainty over whose authority they were expected to follow. One instruction could point toward the household administration, while another appeared to come directly from Camilla's side. That uncertainty had consequences. Staff members allegedly began keeping records of instructions they considered unusual. Dates mattered, names mattered, the wording mattered. A verbal request could disappear once the person who made it left the room. A written instruction could not disappear so easily. This was also why the residence records became so important to Charles's advisors. They were not merely trying to establish what had changed, They were trying to establish whether the changes had followed the proper chain of authority. And the deeper they went, the more significant the timing became. Some decisions had reportedly been made before the relevant questions were fully settled. That meant the palace could not simply look at the final state of Windsor Lodge and assume every change had been approved. It had to trace the decisions backward. Who requested it? Who received the request? Who approved it? Who carried it out? And, most importantly, was anyone told to stop? Those questions turned ordinary paperwork into evidence. That was the point when palace management reportedly became a question of royal accountability. Then one detail reportedly stood out. A warning had allegedly existed before the most controversial changes were completed. If that is accurate, it meant the issue could no longer be explained as an innocent misunderstanding. Someone had apparently raised concerns, and the changes had continued anyway. That single development gave Charles a much harder decision. If he ignored it, he risked allowing a disputed arrangement to continue. If he acted, he risked exposing a family conflict that the palace had every reason to keep private. And while those two options were being weighed, Camilla's position still appeared secure from the outside. That was the trap. The residents could look calm, while the paperwork underneath it was becoming increasingly hostile to the arrangement. The next stage would not be about what anyone believed. It would be about what the documents actually said. And if those documents contained the clause advisors were reportedly searching for, then Charles would soon face the one question nobody inside Windsor Lodge could answer for him. Was Camilla's stay really permanent, or had the clock already started running? If you think a royal title should never be enough to silence questions about accountability, prove you mean it by liking, sharing, and subscribing now, because the next part reveals the document that reportedly made this private dispute far more serious. The document was only a few pages long, but according to the account, it changed the entire calculation inside the palace. Advisors had been looking for confirmation that Camilla's position at Windsor Lodge was secure. Instead, the residence file reportedly contained language that pointed in the opposite direction. The arrangement appeared to depend on conditions, and those conditions mattered because the recent changes had raised questions about how the property was being used. This was the moment the story moved from suspicion into something much more dangerous. The clause reportedly did not say that Camilla could remain, regardless of what happened inside the lodge. It allegedly connected continued occupancy to proper use of the residence, respect for household arrangements, and compliance with restrictions governing royal resources and property. In other words, the right to stay was not necessarily absolute. That distinction was devastating. A permanent residence and a conditional residence may look identical to the public. Behind palace doors, they are completely different things. One suggests security, the other leaves open a mechanism for intervention. Officials reportedly went back through the file more than once because nobody wanted to make a decision based on an incomplete reading. They compared the residence terms with renovation requests, staffing changes, access instructions, and records concerning belongings that had been moved. The comparison allegedly produced another problem. Some of the actions under review had taken place after concerns had already been raised. That meant the palace was no longer asking whether Camilla's household had accidentally crossed a boundary. It was asking whether the boundary had been explained, understood, and then crossed anyway. The distinction mattered enormously to Charles. A king can resolve a misunderstanding quietly. A king facing repeated disregard for written conditions has a different problem. If he intervenes, he has to explain why. If he refuses to intervene, the existing arrangement continues under a cloud of unanswered questions. According to the account, Charles's advisors therefore prepared a more complete assessment. The residence terms were placed beside the spending records. The spending records were compared with the renovation requests. The renovation requests were considered alongside staff instructions. The staff instructions were then compared with access records and the movement of family belongings. Piece by piece, the same issue kept returning. Authority. Who had the final word? Camilla's advisors reportedly believed the answer was obvious because of her position and her relationship with the king. But the documents were forcing officials to separate personal influence from formal authority. That separation was becoming critical. A royal residence can involve several layers of responsibility at once. A person may occupy it without owning it. A household may manage it without having unlimited power over it. Staff may follow instructions while still being required to obey wider administrative rules. The file reportedly reflected that complexity. And then came the issue that made the alleged warning especially important. One of the records indicated that concerns about the handling of the residence had already reached Camilla's side. The warning reportedly questioned whether certain changes should proceed without further approval. If that record is accurate, the palace could no longer treat the disputed actions as something that happened because nobody knew there were restrictions. Someone had apparently raised the issue. The changes allegedly continued. That was the kind of detail Charles's advisors could not simply ignore. There was also the question of the belongings that had been moved. According to the account, some objects associated with earlier generations of the royal family had been removed from rooms where they had traditionally been kept. Their movement created a separate question about whether the residence's shared history was being altered without proper consultation. That issue reportedly carried particular weight because the objects were not ordinary decorations. Their significance came from the people connected to them and the history attached to the rooms. For palace officials, the question became straightforward. Were those objects being moved for a legitimate administrative reason, or were they being removed because the residence was increasingly being treated as a private household? The answer would depend on the records, and the records were becoming harder to dismiss. According to the account, staff documentation showed that certain changes had been planned in advance. Access arrangements had reportedly been altered, rooms had been reassigned, renovation work had been discussed, employees had been moved from established duties. None of those details alone proved an intentional attempt to take control. Together, however, they allegedly created a pattern that Charles's advisors could no longer overlook. Then the spending records added another layer. Some costs associated with the changes were reportedly recorded through ordinary household maintenance arrangements. That raised the question of whether work benefiting Camilla's private use had been properly classified and approved. Again, the issue was not simply money. It was authority. If royal resources had been used for changes that had not received the required approval, then the residence arrangement could be examined under the very conditions that advisors had just rediscovered. This was the point where the alleged clause became more than an old sentence buried in an archive. It became potentially enforceable. The advisors reportedly tested the language against the actions recorded in the file. They considered whether the conditions had actually been breached and whether the household had the authority to intervene without negotiating a new arrangement. The conclusion, according to the account, was serious enough to require Charles's attention. But Charles did not immediately announce anything. That silence created another mystery. Why wait? If the evidence was already concerning, why allow the matter to continue while the king remained publicly silent? The answer, according to the account, was that Charles's advisors wanted the record checked from every direction before placing a recommendation in front of him. They were reportedly looking for anything that could undermine the case: a signed authorization, a private instruction, a written amendment, a record showing that Charles had granted broader authority than the residence file suggested. Anything. Because without such evidence, the palace could potentially face a devastating contradiction. Charles might appear to be reversing an arrangement that he himself had approved. but the search allegedly produced no document that clearly transformed Camilla's conditional occupancy into permanent control. That absence mattered. It did not prove that every rumor surrounding Windsor Lodge was true. It did not establish every allegation about staff or spending, but within the account, it meant that the most important defense available to Camilla's side was becoming harder to support through documentation. Then Charles was reportedly shown the complete file. This was not a single complaint placed on his desk. It was a sequence of decisions, warnings, records, and conditions assembled into one picture. The king now had to confront the issue personally. The residence had been presented as secure. The paperwork suggested limits. The warnings suggested those limits had been challenged. The latest records suggested the dispute had not ended. And suddenly, Charles's final public appearance carried a different significance. Whatever happened next would not simply determine where Camilla stayed. It could signal how the king intended to exercise authority when private royal arrangements collided with formal rules. That is why the next decision mattered so much. Charles could protect the appearance of family unity and leave the dispute buried. Or he could enforce the conditions that his advisors had reportedly uncovered. For the first time, the choice was no longer theoretical. The recommendation was ready. The evidence had been assembled, and the king was about to decide whether the residence would remain in Camilla's hands. And once that recommendation reached the king, there would be no easy way back from it. Before that decision became public, however, one final question had to be answered. What exactly had Charles known, and when had he known it? That answer was about to turn the Windsor Lodge dispute into something far more explosive. If you have stayed this long, do not look away now. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next part reaches the moment the decision stops being a palace review and becomes an order that Camilla can no longer ignore. The order was no longer a possibility. According to the account, it had moved from an internal recommendation to an actual decision, and the timing made the situation even more extraordinary. Charles's final public appearance was approaching, yet behind the scenes, officials were reportedly preparing for the possibility that Camilla would have to leave Windsor Lodge. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation in front of cameras, no public argument between the king and queen. Instead, the palace machinery began moving quietly. That made the situation more serious. Household officials reportedly began preparing the practical details required if Camilla's occupancy was terminated. Access arrangements had to be reviewed, property records had to be checked, staff responsibilities had to be clarified, personal belongings would have to be separated from items belonging to the residence. Every detail had to be settled before anyone could act. According to the account, the final recommendation placed before Charles focused on the same issue that had been buried in the residence records. The arrangement could allegedly be withdrawn if the conditions governing the property were no longer being respected. Charles now had a choice. He could allow the dispute to remain private and preserve the appearance of stability, or he could enforce the conditions and accept the consequences. The decision reportedly came down on the side of enforcement. That was the moment the title of this story became more than a prediction. Camilla was allegedly going to be ordered out of Windsor Lodge, but there was still a question of how the order would be delivered. The palace reportedly wanted to avoid a public confrontation. Any visible dispute between Charles and Camilla would immediately become a spectacle. It could turn a property decision into a constitutional argument about the king's authority inside his own household. So the process was designed to be controlled. A formal notice was reportedly prepared. The document would establish that the existing occupancy arrangement was ending and that household administration would resume control of the residence. It would also address the practical consequences, including access, staff responsibilities, and the handling of personal possessions. The language mattered. This was not supposed to sound like a personal punishment. It was an administrative decision based on the conditions surrounding the property. That distinction would later become central to the palace's position. According to the account, Camilla's side did not initially expect the matter to reach this stage. Advisors had reportedly believed the issue could still be resolved through private discussions. There was apparently an assumption that Charles would not allow a dispute over one residence to become a major family rupture, but Charles had already been given the file. He had already seen the warnings. He had already seen the conditions. And now the king had reportedly made his choice. The notice was delivered. For the people inside Windsor Lodge, the atmosphere changed immediately. The residence that had appeared secure was suddenly operating under a deadline. Camilla's staff reportedly began making calls. Questions were raised about whether the decision could be delayed. Some reportedly believed Charles might reconsider once the consequences became clear. But the deadline remained. That was the difference between this moment and everything that had come before it. Previously, the dispute had depended on conversations. Now it depended on a written order. And written orders create a very different kind of pressure. According to the account, officials began preparing an inventory of the residence. Every room had to be accounted for. Items belonging to Camilla personally had to be distinguished from objects forming part of the royal property. This process reportedly exposed another source of tension. Some belongings could be removed immediately because they were clearly personal. Others were less straightforward. Furniture, paintings, decorative objects, and historical items had to be checked against existing records. Nobody wanted a disputed object leaving the residence before its status had been established. The inventory therefore became more than a checklist. It became a final test of the boundary that had caused the entire dispute. What belonged to Camilla? What belonged to Windsor Lodge? And who had the authority to decide? Those questions were now being answered room by room. The same process reportedly applied to staff. Employees could no longer simply follow private instructions if those instructions conflicted with the new household arrangements. Administrative control had shifted, and that meant the power structure inside the residence was changing before Camilla had physically left. Then came the part that could not be hidden forever: the public appearance. Charles was expected to appear before cameras, while the palace was reportedly dealing with the most sensitive domestic decision of his reign so far. The contrast was striking. Outside, the king would be performing his public duties. Inside, his decision was allegedly changing the status of his wife's residence. That timing created the impression that something much larger was underway. The public could see Charles. They could not see the paperwork. They could not see the officials preparing the handover. They could not see the deadline approaching. And they certainly could not see what Camilla's advisors were reportedly doing in response. According to the account, attempts were made to establish whether the order could be challenged or delayed. The question was whether the king could still be persuaded to reconsider. But the residence file had already been reviewed. The conditions had already been examined. The recommendation had already reached Charles. The decision was moving forward. Then came the final hours before the deadline. Officials reportedly prepared access lists and reviewed which staff members would be present during the handover. Security arrangements were considered, personal belongings were identified, documents were gathered. The palace wanted the process to be controlled from the first moment to the last. There was a reason for that. A chaotic departure would give the story a completely different meaning. A calm administrative handover would allow the palace to argue that this was about enforcing rules, not humiliating Camilla. That distinction would become critical once the story reached the public. And then the deadline arrived. According to the account, household officials appeared at Windsor Lodge to oversee the handover. The scene was reportedly far quieter than anyone might expect from a royal confrontation. There were no crowds, no theatrical announcement. No public argument, just officials, documents, security, and an inventory. That quietness was almost more powerful than a confrontation would have been, because there was nothing for anyone to misunderstand. The order had been issued, the deadline had arrived, and the residence was being returned to household control. Camilla's staff reportedly began removing personal belongings. Boxes were prepared, documents were gathered. Clothing and personal effects were separated from property that officials considered part of the lodge. Every item leaving the building was reportedly checked against the inventory. Then a disagreement emerged over objects whose ownership was disputed. The officials reportedly refused to allow anything to leave simply because an aide claimed it belonged to Camilla. Documentation was required. If the records identified an item as part of the residence, it stayed. That rule transformed the handover into a physical demonstration of the very principle that had driven the investigation. Personal status could not automatically determine ownership. The residence had its own records, and those records now mattered more than assumptions. According to the account, the tension increased as the process continued. Camilla reportedly questioned the authority of the officials overseeing the handover and argued that discussions with Charles were still possible. But the response was reportedly straightforward. The deadline had passed. The order was already in effect. Any further conversation with the king would not automatically suspend it. That was the moment the situation became irreversible. The residents could no longer be treated as though nothing had changed. Control had formally shifted, and there was still one room left to deal with. A room that reportedly contained items whose status had become particularly sensitive. Camilla's side allegedly wanted the room kept private while the dispute was resolved. Officials disagreed. The room was included within the residence. The new authority applied to it as well. For several tense moments, the handover reportedly stalled. Then the officials presented the documentation. There was no separate exception. No private room excluded from the order. No special right surviving beyond the deadline. The final barrier was beginning to collapse. And outside Windsor Lodge, the public still had no idea how far the king's decision had gone. That was about to change, because Charles's final public act was not simply happening alongside the Windsor Lodge dispute. According to the account, it was becoming the moment around which the palace would have to decide whether silence was still possible. The question was no longer whether Camilla would leave. The question was what Charles was prepared to let the public know about why she had to leave. If you have watched this far, do not let the palace silence the most important part of the story. Like, share, and subscribe now, because the final chapter reveals what happened after the order was carried out, and why Charles's decision may have meant far more than Windsor Lodge alone. The most revealing part of the Windsor Lodge story came after the doors were closed and the cameras moved on. According to the account, the departure itself was only the visible ending. The larger consequence was what Charles's decision established inside the royal family. Windsor Lodge was no longer being treated according to assumptions about status or influence. Its future was now tied to the rules governing the residence, and that shift carried consequences far beyond one set of rooms. Once the handover was complete, attention reportedly turned to what had been changed during Camilla's time there. Household officials began reviewing records against the condition of the property. They were not simply looking for missing objects. They were trying to establish which decisions had altered the residence and whether those changes could be reversed. That process mattered because the controversy had never really been about decoration. It was about control. If the account is accurate, the most important change was not the removal of Camilla's personal belongings. It was the restoration of household authority. Decisions about access, staffing, maintenance, and the use of shared rooms could no longer be made on the assumption that Camilla's position gave her unrestricted power. That created a new reality for everyone working around the king and queen. Staff members reportedly became more careful about verbal instructions. Administrators were expected to document decisions that might previously have been handled informally. Questions about property and spending could no longer be brushed aside simply because the person giving an instruction carried royal status. And that is where Charles's role becomes significant. The alleged decision was not merely about telling Camilla to leave a residence. It demonstrated that the king was prepared to enforce a boundary, even when doing so risked creating tension inside his own family. That is why the timing of his final public act matters. According to the account, the public appearance came at the end of a private process that had forced the king to confront uncomfortable questions. The decision surrounding Windsor Lodge therefore became a direct test of Charles's authority when it had to be used against someone close to him. There was also another unresolved issue. How much had Charles known before the review reached him? The account does not provide a definitive answer. It leaves open the possibility that the king had been aware of some changes without knowing the full extent of the dispute. That uncertainty is important because it changes the emotional weight of the story. If Charles knew everything, then the delay becomes difficult to explain. If he knew only part of it, then the records may have revealed a situation that had grown beyond what he understood. Either way, the decision placed him in an uncomfortable position. He could no longer rely on silence to keep the matter contained. The residence had been examined. The disputed arrangements had been documented. The conditions had been interpreted. And the order had been carried out. Then came the question of what happened to the belongings that had caused so much concern. According to the account, household officials reviewed earlier inventories and compared them with the condition of the rooms. Items connected to previous generations were reportedly identified and assessed before being returned or placed under appropriate household control. That detail mattered because the residence was not simply a building, it represented continuity. Objects inside it could carry memories that existed long before the current occupants arrived. Removing those objects could therefore change more than the appearance of a room. It could change what that room represented. The restoration process reportedly aimed to reverse that effect. Rooms were reviewed, records were checked, staff arrangements were reconsidered. The residence was gradually brought back under neutral household administration. For William and Catherine, according to the account, the outcome also carried a personal lesson. Private diplomacy had not been enough. The earlier effort to resolve the dispute quietly had apparently failed. What finally moved the situation forward was documentation. Dates, instructions, records, conditions, and written warnings created a trail that could not easily be dismissed. That is one of the strongest lessons buried inside the story. Power can create confidence, but records create accountability. And the alleged Windsor Lodge dispute showed how quickly the balance can change when those two forces collide. Camilla's position was reportedly weakened not by one dramatic accusation, but by a series of decisions that eventually became part of one larger record. That distinction matters greatly. If the account is accurate, the outcome was not the result of one argument between members of the royal family. It was the consequence of accumulated concerns. Each disputed decision added another question. Each unanswered warning added another layer. By the time Charles faced the final recommendation, the issue had reportedly become too substantial to ignore. That also explains why the story has continued to attract attention. The residence was only the setting. The real story was about the limits of royal authority. How much control does a member of the royal family actually have over a residence? When does personal influence stop and formal authority begin? And what happens when those boundaries are tested? Those questions reach beyond Windsor Lodge and into the way the monarchy manages its properties, staff, traditions, and hierarchy. If the account surrounding Charles's decision proves accurate in its essential details, then the king's action represented a clear warning that royal status alone cannot settle every dispute. There is another reason this ending matters. Camilla's reported departure did not erase the questions surrounding Charles himself. It created new ones. Why did the situation reach this point? Why were concerns allegedly allowed to build before the king intervened? And why did the decisive action come at such a sensitive moment in his public schedule? Those questions may prove more important than the residence itself. Because a king can change who occupies a building. What is harder to change is the trust surrounding the decision. For now, the striking element is that the outcome allegedly came down to something far less glamorous than royal ceremony. Paperwork, conditions, records, and a decision to enforce them. That is what transformed the Windsor Lodge dispute from palace gossip into a story about authority. And it brings the title back into focus. King Charles's last public act, as described in this account, was not simply about appearing before cameras. It allegedly marked the point at which a private royal dispute reached a final decision, and Camilla's future at Windsor Lodge changed with it. Whether every detail of the claims survives scrutiny remains a separate question, but the central mystery remains powerful. What did Charles know? What finally convinced him to act? And if Windsor Lodge was only the first boundary he was prepared to enforce, what happens when the next royal arrangement comes under examination? That is the question worth watching. If you believe powerful people should still be held accountable when the rules are tested, do not just watch this story disappear. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because staying silent is exactly how important questions get buried, and the next story coming to this channel may be even more explosive.